In part 2 of the first way, we find a few fundamental characteristics of this first way. And in particular, there is the need for a first mover or first cause in an essentially ordered series. And here are some of the necessary things. We talked about this before. And so I changed the analogy up a little bit here because I think we've heard this gear one often enough, and I don't think it quite captures exactly what I'm saying. And so I could change the slides for you so you can listen along later, but I forgot to put it in there. In any case, we can think of it this way. So an effect is continuously dependent on the cause. For instance, the acceleration of a baseball depends on the pitcher throwing the ball. And so insofar as an essentially ordered series go, or per se ordered series, the baseball itself is continually dependent upon the pitcher. And the relation of cause and effect in a per se causal series is that the ball is simultaneous. And so for every moment that the ball is accelerating, it needs to have something that accounts for its acceleration. And that immediate thing is going to be the pitcher's accelerating hand. But the accelerating hand is only possible because of the pitcher's muscles. The muscles depend on the nerves, and so on and so on. What we must have here, and this is really important, when it comes to the acceleration of the ball, we have to look at acceleration of all these things, not their inertial motion. That's going to become a little more evident in just a moment here. And so now, why does an essentially ordered series need a first cause? Well, Aquinas, first of all, he holds that every essential causal series needs a first cause, but we don't want to argue from authority, which is, I think, sometimes that a lot of people do that when they're making a case for God's existence, coming from Aquinas' first way. They'll cite, well, St. Thomas says that there's no officially ordered, there has to be a first cause in any officially ordered causal series that's ordered per se. Okay, that's great. We have to argue for that. So now, by first, again, he does not mean in the order of temporal succession. Rather, he means first as the most fundamental, primary, or principal mover and cause and explanation of motion in the world. And in any causal series, the first or primary cause always has the actuality lacking in the effect, and it has this actuality lacking in the instrumental cause as well. But the instrumental causes are capable of passing this causality on. So when considering the acceleration of ball, for instance, you have to conclude to the pitcher's soul as the first principle as the principle of life and the principle of self-motion, because the soul virtually contains the form of acceleration, because life is a self-motive principle according to Aristotle, and so the soul is going to be the first mover in a pitching motion that explains the acceleration of the ball in a causal series ordered per se, and the soul is also that which gives the power to accelerate to every other member of the series. Now, there's a really important concept here, okay? Thomas's 5 ways, again, do all essentially depend on the concept of an essentially ordered causal series, or per se causal series, or one that's in inferi, or sorry, not inferi, but in esse, causa in esse, even if there are some elements of causa inferi, causes becoming causes of being. And that each of the 5 ways doesn't explain why a thing exists in time, except accidentally, in the sense that if a thing exists physically, then it exists in time, but rather it's asking the question, why do things exist at all? That's what Aquinas is looking at. So when it comes to the need for a first cause, why is it the case that every instrumental cause requires a first or principal cause? We've gone over this before, but we're going to go over again because this is something that is really difficult for people to get their minds around, and it's something that we really need to have our teeth sunk into in order to really explain these arguments of God's existence. So instrumental causes are causes that do not possess the requisite actuality to produce some final effect. They are merely potential to bringing about that effect, or even in potential to being able to cause that effect. So a ball, a hand, an arm, muscles, nerves, and brain, they all have the potential to bring about the effect of accelerating a ball, but only instrumentally. Adding And now, and if we think about this, if we just add more and more instrumental causes, another arm, another brain, another hand, another set of nerves, another muscle, this will not grant the series, or does not explain why the series has the requisite actuality to bring about the final effect of the ball accelerating. Again, think about this mathematically. All of these things are neutral to the notion of accelerating motion. So it'd be like taking 0 plus 0 plus 0 plus 0 plus 0 plus 0 plus 0. No matter how many zeros you add, you'll always get 0 accelerating motion. Dead pitchers don't win games. And even an infinite series of dead pitchers don't win games. The ball, the hand, the muscle, the nerves, and all the brains all have instrumental potentiality for acceleration here, but in themselves are, again, acceleration neutral. Now, if you add a hand to an arm, to a muscle, to the nerves, and a brain, this is great. You can add as many of these things you want. The ball still won't be thrown, and if we're observing the acceleration of a ball, isolated from, other things, it still won't explain why the ball is thrown. You can't just say that there's an arm and nerves and muscles and a brain that are doing these things. You need to have something that goes beyond and outside this order of things which only receive the power to accelerate in order to explain the acceleration of the ball. And so, the series can only be granted this actuality to accelerate other things by something that has the requisite actuality which the instrumental causes lack, and thus is not dependent or in potential in the way that the instrumental members of the series are, although it might be in potential in other ways. And so this is why we come to the soul, again, which has the principle of motion in itself, essentially as a definitional feature of what it is, which has within the range of its, at least with humans anyway, with the range of its potentials, range of its motion, the ability to accelerate things like a ball through the instrumental causality of their nervous system, muscles, and hand. And so we see, continuing on this same theme, we see that there are things in the world that are changing, and remember that change is continuous and necessary. Change is the accrual of a new form, right? So a thing takes on a new form. When we're talking about accidental change, or even substantial change, either substantial or accidental. In substantial change, the primary matter takes on a new substantial form, and in accidental change, the substance itself takes on a new accidental form, new way of existing. But a thing cannot give what it does not, what it lacks. And so, if it doesn't have the form, so if a car doesn't have the form of redness in it, how can it give itself redness? It doesn't. It can't. It's not how it works. Changing things requires an external, essentially ordered, related cause to actualize the change. Because remember, change is an ongoing process. Once you remove the cause of the change, you remove the effect of change, or the process of change, and stops. If this cause is also changing, then it too requires an essentially ordered related cause, and so on and so forth. Causes which require causes are then again called instrumental causes. And even if there were an infinite series of these instrumental causes actualizing an ultimate change, such as a ball moving from being red to being green, then on its own, this series would never possess the actuality necessary to bring about the change that we're observing. So there must be a principal, primary, or fundamental, or first cause of changing things. Moving on to part... one more note here. In every essentially ordered series containing instrumental causes, even if it were possible for there to be an infinite number of causes, there must still be a primary cause which possesses the actuality that the instrumental causes lack. You can't get something from nothing. So, for instance, with respect to directed with the first way, or rather, think of a train. You see a train moving, and you can say that, well, and you know that it's a segmented train, only like 6 boxcars or whatever, but it's moving. Well, it's not the boxcars that are moving themselves. And you know that's to be the case because the boxcars aren't the kind of thing that can move themselves. There has to be something outside that series, gravity, or an electrified track, even if you don't see an engine. There still has to be a first cause for that series, which is external to it, to give the actuality to those things which they themselves do not possess. Moving on to part 3, we see that the first cause itself must be something that's unchanging. The reason for this is that all changes require a cause. Thus, if the first cause is unchanging, then it too requires a cause of its changing. But if a first cause is being caused to change, then it is potentially not in actuality. It is in potentiality and not in actuality. In the same way that the members of the changing series are, and so you just have yet another member of the series. In which case, this proposed cause would be dependent on a prior cause, just as the members of the rest of the series, and then it would be an instrumental, not a first cause. But a principal cause is necessary in order to explain the changing of the infinite series, or changing in the series, or changing at the end of the series. And it's also necessary to explain why the instrumental causes have causal power at all, because every instrumental cause has causal power derivatively rather than essentially or principally. And without a principal cause, there'd be no motion at all. So therefore, there must be a first cause which is not changing. But what if this cause is going from actuality to potentiality? Then, well, again, it too would have to be explained by an external source. Hence, it wouldn't in itself have the power to bring about a certain effect. And the motion that we're trying to explain would be left unexplained, or it simply wouldn't even be happening at all. Therefore, there must be a first unmoved mover from which all things receive their actualization. Which means that this thing, whatever it happens to be, simply cannot be a changing thing. The point is to explain things which derive their ability to actualize other things, or to explain changing things. You have to eventually come down to something which is of a different quality or nature than the things that you're trying to explain. Now, I want to make a quick comparison to Aristotle, between Aristotle and Aquinas' attempts at the argument for motion. So Aristotle first asserts that motion is occurring in an eternal universe, and from this he derives the need for an eternal mover. And now in the Summa Contra Gentiles, Aquinas takes on the same burden, saying this is a great way to kind of give the detractor or somebody who doesn't believe in God a bone, give them a little bit of an advantage. Because if the universe doesn't have a beginning, well, it makes it seem a lot harder to prove that God exists, and so he takes the same approach. But for Aristotle, what's different here? You notice something very interesting. And again, the reason why I'm addressing this is because that it's really important for us to remember that Aquinas' arguments do not focus on the same metaphysical content as Aristotle's arguments. But what we see in Aristotle is that each heavenly body is actually attached to a unique celestial sphere, each with its own unmoved mover or sphere soul, which is an essence that is unmoved in itself. We're not entirely sure what it is. We just know that there happens to be a first cause or a first unmoved mover of these different celestial spheres. And now these celestial spheres are the planets and the stars, and ultimately the moon, and ultimately the sun. And there are up to 55 movers in all, although there could also be 47, according to Aristotle. The discrepancy in the difference in number is due to the fact that astronomers have identified 47 or 55 celestial spheres. Now, the mover of there is a primary mover, and this is the mover of the outermost sphere, which is for Aristotle the sun. And the reason why Aristotle gets here is that the only act-potency relationship under consideration for Aristotle is that between matter and form. And Aristotle, again, thinks that there's 55 unmoved forms, with one of them being the biggest, coolest, and the principal form. These things actually refers to as gods. Aquinas, on the other hand, thinks that we can't prove that motion itself has a beginning and point in time. But his proof doesn't rely on this, which is why he grants it in the Summa Contra Gentiles version of the first mover argument. So Aquinas, on the other hand, thinks that the ultimate prime mover is absolutely unique. Though it's possible for him that the heavenly bodies are moved by angels or some other cause. They didn't have the same theories of gravitation and whatnot, although they weren't. That doesn't mean that they posited some supernatural explanation for every natural phenomena. Rather, they did their best to explain things according to some sort of natural motion. But for Aquinas, the prime mover is not only the cause of motion, but the cause of existence itself, which is what we're going to see here in a very short moment. So, we have a problem. We know that the principal causes are and act in a way that members of the causal series are merely in potency. But it's impossible for the principal cause to be in potency and not in act in some other way. Oh, sorry, but it is possible, for a principal cause to be in potency and not in act some other way. We know that the first cause is in act in a way that movers are only in potency. But how do we know the first cause is not in potency in some other way and hence not ultimately first? So with Aristotle's arguments, for instance, his notion of the prime mover is not something that in principle is the uttermost actuality. In fact, for Aristotle and for the Greeks, to be infinite in scope is actually an imperfection, because the only thing for them that would be infinite would be prime matter, and prime matter is essentially non-being. And so for Aristotle, to say that God is infinite and infinite in an absolutely unqualified sense, then that'd be saying that God is nothing and that there's nothing moving the universe. And then furthermore, because Aristotle's focusing on form and matter rather than existence or esse, what we have at the end of each one of Aristotle's different movers or causal series is a form. And the thing is, form is always denotes some sort of a limitation on being. It could always act in a different way. And so the first mover, the primary mover in Aristotle's arguments, could have their potentiality actualized in a different way. In fact, this is even what allows them to be multiple in the first place, because if there were if it was absolutely infinite, there's nothing that could be added to it in order to make them different. But since they are different, we know that each one of them has a limitation by which we're able to identify them as particular and unique, which we talked about a bit last week with the existential or metaphysical core of Aquinas' 5 ways. But for Aquinas, esse changed the game. Esse is the act of all actualities, and that in potentialities, potentials are only actualized in beings that actually exist, and thus the existence is the most metaphysically fundamental principle of actuality. As discussed last week, those things in which essence and esse are distinct have an essence which is existentially neutral. That is, it's indifferent to the act of existence. And this is what we call the essence under absolute consideration. It's a very important concept for you guys to understand. If you're having trouble with that notion, please go read the 2 documents that I wrote on called St. Thomas Goes to Sodor and Lily the Phenomenal Dancing Utah Raptor. Both of those will help you understand the notion of the essence considered under absolute consideration. But if you have any further questions, go ahead and email me, and we'll find a time to chat. So now, in order to have any of its essential features, like motion, life, or intelligence, a thing must first have existence. But since the changing thing can only change itself on the level of essence, it cannot be the ultimate explanation of the existence of the change. Remember, change is an accident which has its own distinct esse which is called in esse, from the substance itself. And so, the same goes for any instrumental series. If their essence is not esse, then all existential motion has no grounding or source. And if there is no grounding or source, then there is no existential motion at all. So whatever causes existence must have existence in a non-derived and therefore essential manner. And so thus the cause of existence is the most fundamental cause upon which all other things depend, both for their existence and for their ability to act. Which brings us back to that objection. I want to revisit that. A thing can be actual in one sense with respect to a series, but potential in another sense. A gear has the power to produce torque in itself. Great. But it's in potency to be electrified, to be powered by something else, electricity, by the plant or whatever. And so, could this first existential mover which has existence essentially ever be in potency or changed in some way? So now on the level of essence, that is form of matter, the answer is yes. A first mover could, in principle, have, in a specific causal series, could have actuality one way but not another. This is because form limits the scope of how a thing can go about existing. On the level of esse, however, the question doesn't even make sense. What can be given to a thing whose essence is pure and infinite, is in a pure and infinite sea of existence? Well, here's the answer. Nothing. To even consider the possibility of adding something to God as pure existence is not only a non-starter, it's actually patently absurd. one may just as well suggest that adding red to redness to change it to red is a real change. I don't even know what that means. It's bizarre. The thing can't be an act in the same way, or the thing can't be in potency in the same way that is actually an act. An essay is the most fundamental act. So therefore, we have to remember that Aquinas' 5 ways are existential. In the first way, we're not just looking at change, but the existence of change in things, and the in essay of that change. We must maintain an acute focus in all of St. Thomas's 5 ways on the act of existence rather than getting distracted by things on the order of form in essence, even though those things may be our entry point to some extent. So therefore, the cause of the phenomena that we examine in the first way, which is the existence of things in motion, or the existence of motion itself, must be the cause of existence and therefore the most fundamental, primary, or principal cause in principle, period. Nothing could be a greater cause than it. And so, just to zip through the first way again, change is change is the motion of potential for existence to an actually new way of existing, and it's a moving towards that way of existing. But change can only occur in real changing things, real existing things. The apple only changes from green to red because the green apple actually exists. And so Aquinas is not only trying to explain change, he's trying to explain the existence of change as such. And when we pursue the first way according to existence rather than through, or essay, rather than through formal causality, we get to the first cause of things, which is the most absolute and most fundamental cause, because we're looking at the existence, which is itself the most fundamental actuality of the things that undergo change. That's enough for now, and you guys will get the rest of the lecture later tonight.